Hi, everyone. This is Friday, July 28th. It's time to deploy. Welcome to Deploy on Friday. I'm your host, John Bristow. Unfortunately, Jim Pelletier is still on leave, but that's okay. We will forge along without him. And we've got a lot of great news and content, as I adjust my camera here, for us to discuss today. And let's just get right into it. So I will, through the magic of software, switch over to my screen here. Let's just take a look at some of the news articles and things that caught our attention for the week, shall we? So, octopus.com, we've got a new page for discussing tenanted deployments. So you'll find this under our use case banner, if I can talk correctly, under tenanted deployments. You might wonder, what is a tenanted deployment? Well, if you're doing things relative to software deployments that involve tenants, which are basically sort of like, you can think of as conceptual slices of your application. So let's assume that using the octopus analogy, you have something like spaces or some kind of way of separating parts and pieces of your application. They are essentially like kind of like copies to each other. A good way of thinking of this is like a SaaS sort of application. This is what a tenant can be considered as. So this is a new use case page that we've now posted up on our website that talks a lot about this. And if you're at all curious about how tenanted deployments work and what they are and all those sorts of things, you can go and read this page. And I love the design we have for this, which is fantastic. We talk a lot about where and when you might use these, in what context, how they fall into a CI/CD pipeline, for example, and how you can apply them to your application development. One of the nice things about tenanted deployments, obviously, is the fact that with tenanted deployments, you can actually build an application that is not built for tenanted purposes, but still apply it using a deployment tool like Octopus to achieve the same result. So if you haven't taken the time to essentially separate your application into each of the various tenants that you have, you can get around those issues by utilizing a tool such as this. And we have a lot of examples of customers who have gone about doing this, and we highlight some of the examples there. So Stack Overflow, Guestline, Geta. These are three of the success stories where folks have been using tenanted deployments and tenants very successfully in the context of Octopus. In addition to that, we also have a webinar coming up later this month in August, featuring Guestline. So they're a hospitality company, and they have a webinar entitled "How They Saved 2,000 Hours Per Release Using Octopus." So that's really exciting stuff, and that will be later in August. And so if you're at all curious about how tenants work and how you can apply them in the context of Octopus Deploy relative to your application, you can go ahead and check out that page there, which is fantastic. We forge ahead with a lot of blog writing, this week being no different. Sean Cesna, who's a member of our team, wrote this article entitled "How to Deploy Azure Container Apps." And Sean basically talks a little bit about what Azure Container Apps are and how they work, but more importantly, talks a little bit about how we actually have two new step templates to support their deployment within Octopus. So this is an article that was written just a couple of days ago. And in the article, he cites an example that we built out called eShop on Web. This is a sort of fictitious example of an application of how you might deploy this. But in the article, he shows walking through Azure, the console here, creating a new registry instance, and being able to utilize that within the context of Azure for container deployment. And then further down in the blog post, after he's gone through all the series of steps to set this up, he then configures Octopus Deploy with an external feed to point to that container registry, which you see here, something that we have built in. You can we have a variety of different registry types built in. If you haven't seen this before, this is a feature of Octopus. You can basically point to a variety of feed types. And then further down here, we actually have our new step template for a deployment process. So when we go about creating a deployment process, obviously everyone's deployment process will differ depending on the type of target that they choose to target. But in this case here, we have a new step template that we can use called Create Container App Environment. And as you can see, you can specify a whole variety of inputs for setting things up relative to that. And this will allow you to basically, as it says, set up a container app environment. And then the second step that we have is our deploy API container app step. And so this is, again, takes a lot of inputs here. These are necessary, obviously, when connecting to Azure. So you have to specify things like the subscription ID and the client ID and the tenant ID, etc. But once those things have been established and specified, you can use those within the context, the confines of a deployment process within Octopus, which is pretty awesome. So if you're at all curious about how these things work and how you can use them inside the context of a deployment process that may look something like this, you can read Sean's article, and he talks a little bit about how to set that all up. And so that's something we've just recently added support for in Octopus, and I think that's pretty cool. In addition to that, we've also been pretty busy on the video side. So we recently hosted our community town hall in July, and I had Steve, Bob, Ian, and James join me on the town hall, and we discussed a few things there, which was fun. We had some demos from folks like James and Bob. Steve talked to us about the State of Continuous Delivery report that was published by the CD Foundation and Slashdata. And Ian, he's a PM on the team, talked to us about the roadmap and a lot of stuff that he's working on around tenants, which is fantastic. And then Bob Walker recently did a presentation with Redgate, specifically on Flyway DB, which allows you to basically see in advance, you could basically do a dry run of a database deployment using Flyway in the context of Octopus, which is awesome. And this is really important if you're looking to evolve your database schema over multiple versions. You can get a sense of what these things look like as part of the deployment process. And you get various reports as part of that process, which is great. And so you can check out that there. And that video is up on our YouTube channel for you to check out if you're at all interested as well. So that's something that we have also done, which is great. We're also on Credly. So Credly is a digital credential tool. It basically allows you to assert various sort of credentials that you've gained from companies, etc. You may have seen these if you've ever taken a certification course from Microsoft or from Amazon or Google, etc. They provide you with these digital badges. And so we've recently signed up with Credly. We're now available there. And we've recently published a badge for Octopus Insiders, which is part of our community program. And we will be adding more badges, so more on that later, to this list of badges that we have. And we will be issuing these out depending upon the type of badge that we're issuing out. So stay tuned for that, which is, I like Credly a lot. It's a really great platform. All right, so that wraps up a little bit of the Octopus news and some of the things that we've done relative to that. And so moving on to some of the articles and news that we saw during the week. And so this is an article from the folks over at Logs. And this is interviewing. This is a radio interview that talked to Oleg, who's a member of he's a core maintainer of the Jenkins project. So Oleg has been part of the Jenkins project for a long time. Jenkins being probably the continuous integration, continuous platform, CI platform. And so Oleg talks a little bit about how you can shed light on CI/CD pipelines. Too often, when you're doing a deployment via CI/CD pipeline, you may not get visibility into what's actually happening there. So most notably, people don't know when things may or may not happen relative to those pipelines. So you typically run a compile step, you'll do a build, you'll do a test, and then you may do a tentative deployment via Octopus. And you may set it up so you get various alerts and such across those pipeline executions. But in this article here, Oleg, or rather in this podcast, Oleg talks to the folks over at Logs about how you can actually utilize a variety of tools that are out there to inspect your CI/CD pipelines. And there's a variety of ways in which you can do this, and they cite some examples there. One of the things that they also cite is a new specification called the CD event specification. We've talked about this a few times on Deploy on Friday, and I've talked to a variety of colleagues about this as well. The CD event specification is one that is under the auspices of, I believe, the CD Foundation. But what it does is it defines a common specification or protocol for leveraging or raising certain events that can fire during a deployment. So if you read the specification itself, it defines a whole bunch of things of when deployments actually occurred, whether they were successful or not, any errors that occurred along the way. And so it defines a common contract for these types of events. And the reason why that's good is because obviously you don't want to rewire all of that stuff if you choose to replace your deployment tool or delivery tool with something else in the future. And so by having a common specification, common standard, you then can just receive those same events and just rewire the location of where they're coming from. And so the goal there with the CD events specification is to define a common contract that vendors that support it can observe. And so this is another way in which you can actually increase the observability or visibility into your CI/CD pipelines. And so that's a specification that enables that. Then Oleg goes on to talk a little bit about OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry, again, is yet another specification that a lot of folks are building and leveraging. A lot of vendors have jumped on this. So you've got the common sort of Datadogs and Splunks, et cetera, who have jumped on this. But OpenTelemetry also can apply to a variety of other tools as part of your pipeline as well. And if you have a general description of how these events occur, and then you can aggregate them accordingly via a protocol like OpenTelemetry, you can create essentially a bunch of syncs as part of this. It does provide a really nice solution as part of observability. Anyways, this was a pretty cool podcast and definitely something worth checking out. And Oleg, obviously being heavily involved in the Jenkins community, talks a lot about this as part of that interview, which is great. Another article that I saw, top Kubernetes security tools in 2023. So Kubernetes is something that we're adding increasingly more support for inside of Octopus. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how folks may utilize Kubernetes in the context of Octopus. And so it's very much front and center on our minds. And so Kubernetes security is often identified as one of the sort of aspects around deployment of Kubernetes applications to clusters that is critical, and being able to determine whether things are configured correctly or you're limiting your attack surface area, et cetera, is very important. And so this article, which is posted on the CNCF blog, talks a little bit about how these tools are available and what sort of various topics of they address. And so the way that it defines it here are the 4 C's of Kubernetes security: cloud, cluster, container, and code. And most developers would be familiar with at least code, if not also containers. When doing anything with Kubernetes, obviously you have to think about clusters, and then when hosting it, you obviously have to think about cloud. So when thinking about these things, there's a variety of ways in which you can actually configure these services and these parts and pieces of plumbing. And so this article talks about the various tools that are available to you there. For cloud, that's mostly leveraged through the providers that are available. So your big ones like your Googles, your Amazons, your Microsofts, etc. They all provide facilities there. From the cluster perspective, obviously utilizing well-known protocols, etc., like TLS, obviously comes into play. Being able to support identity via OIDC or LDAP directories, for example, being authenticated, not much you can do there. From the tooling side, relative to containers, there's a variety of things that you can do there to inspect. And then when the code comes in, there's things that you can also do there. So in terms of tools, there's a variety of tools that are cited. So Kubescape is one example that provides facilities for folks who are deploying to Kubernetes as an example. So they cite this as something that you can look at. Excuse me. Cilium, which is something that was mentioned in my talk with Michael Levon as part of an interview series that I do with the Octopus Deploy channel. This is for eBPF, which is the basically the binary for as part of the containers themselves. So Cilium provides that solution for observing these things within a Kubernetes cluster. Falco is another example that's cited. Sorry, get rid of the cookies. So Falco allows you, as they say here, detect security threats in real time. So it gives you an observability aspect to it. Kong's another example here, if utilizing API servers. So this is another example of a tool that's mentioned, and others as well. So if you're at all curious, if you're doing anything with Kubernetes and you care about some of the security tools that are there, maybe in a prescriptive manner, you can utilize those that are mentioned there. And that's a great article worth mentioning. So that's up on the CNCF website at cncf.io. Moving right along, GitLab has announced support with JetBrains IDEs, or possibly JetBrains is announcing support for GitLab. So JetBrains provides a number of IDEs out there. They have IDEs for Go, they have IDEs for C# and Java, Kotlin, etc. They invented Kotlin, obviously. And so JetBrains is adding support for GitLab as part of its integrated environment experience. So GitLab is a very well known and supported CI environment, has CD capabilities as well. And so what they're mostly bringing to the table here is integrated experience through extensions for all their IDEs. So you can map user profiles, and then it provides a basic level of integrations with merge requests. So if you're doing anything with code and you're submitting PRs and merge requests, etc., this is where basically a lot of the heavy lifting is done. This is obviously the first iteration of this, so I would expect to see more features come online as these tools evolve. But you can do things like diff compares, etc. You can obviously compare changes. And so that's a nice and welcome addition to the IDEs there. If you're at all using GitLab and you want to have integration within those experiences, i.e. Goland or Rider, etc., those are now available there, and that's available from JetBrains, which is fantastic. Moving along, this was a survey that HashiCorp chose to talk a little bit about. So Forrester ran a series of surveys with folks, and they published a report entitled the State of Cloud Strategy Survey. So this is done with HashiCorp. And the survey itself interviewed a whole bunch of different folks. As you can see here, 242 global respondents, and they had folks who were in a set of services or industries rather, with a total sample size of 963 from a variety of industries around the world. And the results are clear, as they say. They do highlight them here, and I just wanted to point them out here. These are kind of like highlighting some of the things relative to cloud. So 48% boasted cloud spending in the last year, despite the macro economic uncertainty. So they've not boasted, boosted. I should read that more carefully. But so they've increased basically the amount they've spent on cloud, which is obviously not unsurprising. 94% say multi-cloud is working or is expected to in the next year. So multi-cloud is obviously a challenge that we care a great deal about at Octopus, and we think a lot about that relative to deployments. And so we want to make sure that our customers are well supported relative to that. And so multi-cloud is a reality for folks for a variety of reasons, whether it's cost or features, etc. Typically, you'll see a lot of organizations use more than one vendor. 54% are using multi-cloud to promote reliability. So they're using, like, let's say they're using AWS as their primary cloud provider, and then they may use Azure as maybe a backup. That is something that they can use. Number one and number two rank of compliance and skill shortages as multi-cloud barriers in the tech industry. So compliance and skills, compliance is always a tough one, right? So you've got to make sure that things are looking correct. And then skills, that's just the reality of the nature of the workforce. Cloud moving so fast, and so many skills that are meant to be brought to bear to understand all this stuff. It's not surprising. 74% say multi-cloud helps them attract, motivate, and retain talent. Fair. And then 91% rely on platform teams. That's also very true. So platform engineering, platform teams, folks who are treating their development as a product delivery and getting less away from the sort of DevOps approach and more towards the platform engineering approach makes sense as well. And so this was a survey that was conducted. It's available now. You can go check it out there. It's available as a PDF. And I thought that was interesting to note. If you're at all interested in a multi-cloud strategy, this might provide some good information for you. This was a interesting post that I saw entitled "The Fall of Stack Overflow." This was published a couple days ago, and it is an analysis of some of the data that is available from Stack Overflow relative to the traffic, the posts, the likes, etc. And I think it speaks to the fact that AI is having a disruptive change to folks who are looking for answers to programming questions. Now, that's one assumption that you could make. Another one might be, it might be a cultural thing. For those who have ever used Stack Overflow may understand that when you post a question that may be of the newbie variety, you may get, downvoted, etc. So that's something to take account. But there are a bunch of speculative suggestions as to why this has occurred. But if we take a look at the data, you can see that the traffic over the last, say, year and a half has seen a little bit of a decline. And incidentally, the addition of ChatGPT occurred around November 2022. So I remember ChatGPT became broadly available around that time. And since that time, it's actually been on a steady decline. So one of the assumptions you could make is that AI has had a disruptive impact on this. That is possible. Also, the integration of engagement. So again, if you're looking at things like votes, these are highly interactive operations with Stack Overflow, there has been a significant decline in terms of voting ever since May of 2020, which is surprising to say the least. I mean, we had COVID, we had a lot of folks locked locked in their houses and not really doing much. I don't know how to explain this other than maybe maybe it's a variety of reasons. It's highly speculative, but there's certainly a downslope on this. Same thing goes for posts. So posts have also greatly decreased over time, and it's hard to say why those things have occurred, but take it for what it's worth, I guess. And some people have speculated that it's possibly AI and its disruptive nature that is causing that decline. But yeah, the author here talks a little bit about how there was a change recently made to the way that categorization of Google Analytics relative to the cookie there has been done. And so that reflects about a 15% variance. So the summary here, over the past 1.5 years, Stack Overflow has lost about 35% of its traffic, is interesting. And this is data available from Stack Overflow itself. So it tries not to be biased. But I just thought this was interesting, to say the least. And a site, people asserting the fact that it's AI makes the following announcement all so much more interesting. So Stack Overflow announces Overflow AI. So Overflow AI is a new integration of a large language model through Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow, there's a video that accompanies this. And in the video, you'll see some examples of this. But the video talks a little bit about how Stack Overflow is now integrating AI capabilities into its platform. So they're calling it Overflow AI. And what it allows you to do is not only get answers to questions, but also provide generative answers as well. So typically search is the way that most folks will utilize Stack Overflow. Google is by far the number one path that people find themselves on Stack Overflow. And what they're doing now is adding capabilities to this process. So you can continue, as they show here, the conversation by getting an AI response. But in addition to that, you can also generate responses as well as part of this process. And so they talk a little bit about how they're utilizing this as part of the experience going forward. And they're going to be applying this to a variety of other types of environments as well. So they talk a little bit about how there's integration with Slack, there's integration with Teams, which is basically a sort of a walled garden for organizations, if you will, of Stack Overflow. So Slack integration, Visual Studio Code integration, what they allow you to do is ask questions within those contexts, and those will feed back into Stack Overflow, whether you're asking questions or providing context there. And so this is a pretty significant announcement. It's sort of like I dubbed this sort of if you can't beat them, join them type approach, which is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that any way in which you can utilize AI in a meaningful way that provides a benefit, I think is going to be a good thing. So going forward, this will be a very interesting space to watch. And Overflow AI is the new way in which Stack Overflow is trying to, I guess, compete, which is great. Another tool that I use quite a bit, Telerik Fiddler Everywhere. Fiddler Everywhere is in my must-have category. It's right up there with Postman, Visual Studio Code, a computer, so electricity. It's sort of like context in the air we breathe. We have to have it. The reason why is because if you're utilizing anything to do with networks, which let's be honest, everyone does everything with APIs and networks today. You need to know what's happening on the wire, and Fiddler Everywhere is a great tool to do that. Fiddler, the classic application, is Windows only, and so the reason why I tout Fiddler Everywhere is because I'm running on a Mac, and obviously I need to support that. So Fiddler Everywhere 4.4 is out with a new layout. It's got a better initial run experience, etc. Incidentally, Fiddler Everywhere uses a UI framework called Kendo UI, and that's a web framework, and they utilize it quite nicely. And so you can see they've got a new layout here for the variety of views that are common in Fiddler. Fiddler is, for those who have never used it, it's just a proxy trace tool. What it does is it just sniffs out the wire and then just reflects what's happening on the wire based on a variety of targets, and you can see the traffic there. It supports HTTP2 now officially with this release. Supports TLS for encrypted sessions. You may wonder, like, how is that? Well, you have to provision you have to add a fictitious certificate in order to view those sessions. But it does allow you to do that, so you can actually trace what's happening on the wire. This is great for debugging. There's a tool in there in particular called Composer, which is fantastic. If you're ever wanting to figure out what's happening or what's wrong with your requests or what's coming back from the server as a response, it will allow you to do those things. So as I said before, it's got a new onboarding environment. HP2 is now official support, so that's great, and definitely something that we need. And then there's a variety of improvements that have been made to Composer, which is great. So Fiddler Everywhere, definitely something I would recommend highly. And then finally, to wrap things up, this is an article from Slack Engineering. I love these types of posts, and anything that comes from an engineering team that kind of highlights things that we learn, things that we do, considerations you may want to apply in your development practices, I think is a good thing. And so this article is entitled Service Delivery Index, a Driver for Reliability. And in this article, two members of the engineering team at Slack talk a little bit, about a new index that they've derived called the Service Delivery Index. What this is, or SDI, they define it as Service Delivery Index Reliability, or SDIR for short, is basically a composite number that gives them a snapshot value of how they're doing relative to not only the API calls that Slack invokes, but also the workflows that are kicking off within a user context. So if you've used Slack before, or if you haven't, it's very much like Teams or Mattermost or Discord for all the gamers out there. It's basically a chat environment, a real-time environment mostly, for folks to collaborate within an organization. And the two main workhorses of Slack are the APIs that it has and the workflows that it supports. So workflows are kind of like the sort of unspoken hero, I think, of Slack, because they allow you to do a lot of really cool things and get alerts about things, perform operations. It has a rich design time experience that you can use as well. They've got a language for creating UI. It's great. And so what they've devised here is an index or score that allows them to say, how are we doing relative to the user experience? And we're calling that the Service Delivery Index. That also provides them how well are we doing relative to delivering what we're promising to deliver via a SaaS model. So too often they cite things like, uptime is great, but that's not the be all and all of a user's experience. And so they talk about how do they comprise this. So API availability is based on the number of successful requests divided by the number of total requests. So that's a pretty easy one to understand. And then overall availability is the uptime of the status site that they host times the amount of the availability metric that was calculated previously. That's the overall availability that they determine. And based on that metric or that index, they can get a snapshot of how they're doing at any point relative in time. I like indexes like this. I think indexes that are product specific, that get you or garner a view of the world fast and easily, will really help you in terms of getting a sense of how you're doing relative to your SaaS. So if you're a SaaS provider and you're providing an application experience and you're at all wondering like what's happening relative to customers, these and other types of metrics can really, really help. And so the engineering talks a little bit about that. They also talk about some of the other aspects that come into this relative to how they determine quality of service. They base that on 4 measurements based around security, performance, quality, and reliability. And they have different measures for that. And how you gauge and judge these things obviously will depend on the type of application and your organization. But I think it's a really, really good example of some of the ways in which you can measure these things, and in particular, gain benefit from doing so. So that's, again, available from the Slack engineering folks. And I thought that was an excellent example of something you can do yourself. Anyway, that's about wraps it up for this edition of Deploy on Friday. Once again, Jim is away on leave, but he'll be joining us next week. I hope you're all having a great week, and we hope to see you here next time on